Welcome to Stump the Pastor number 14. Today's question comes from Gary from Minnesota. Gary asks, why were there no dinosaurs on the ark? Well, thanks for the question, Gary. Actually, Gary is a former neighbor from when Bill and I lived in Minneapolis, and he just turned 50 this last week, so happy birthday, Gary. Well, the story to which Gary is referring, of course, can be found in the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis. This story is part of the early stories that are found in Genesis that precede Christianity and obviously also precede Judaism. So, my question in return, offered in the same spirit that Gary asked his question, is, why not dinosaurs on the ark? You see, the Bible doesn't tell us what specific animals were included or not included. So if there were going to be possums, we could have dinosaurs too. And I say that with a bit of jest because when animals were in a fairly small structure floating around for weeks, that isn't really the point of the story. This story, like many stories from the beginning narratives, are what are called classical myths. Now, we hear the word myth, and we immediately understand that to mean something is not true. But a classical myth is a story about truth. So Noah and the ark is not a true story. It is a story about truth. The truth being asserted is that God's grace made a way for creation to survive its destruction. Why do we know that a global flooding story is a myth story? Because almost every culture that has ever existed has a myth story about destructive flooding. In fact, you may be surprised to learn that the Bible isn't the only religious book that refers to the earth being destroyed by flooding waters. I mean, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to almost every culture on earth today, including China, India, and most Native American tribes, a massive flood story is part of their cultural or religious history. Now, some would say that means that actually there was a global flood that happened at some point in history. Or that it could mean is that lots of cultures have experienced massive floods at some point, and it felt like their whole world was being swept away. And then when you tell me your flood story, it sounds a lot like my flood story, and so they all begin to kind of run together. And when something destroys our world, or even our part of the world, we want to make sense of what happens. We can't make sense of senseless destruction. So we create stories about the impact of the destructive event and figure out what's God's place in the story that might be there. The problem comes when we start treating myths as factual, because the facts don't add up. How does one fit all the animals of the world, even a representative pair of them, on a small boat, even without dinosaurs? How can it rain enough to cover the entire earth? Reading these stories through the eyes of logic makes them silly. Reading these stories through the eyes of faith reveal the character of God. It's strange, isn't it? I mean, the ancients who told these stories originally, whom we assume to be less educated and less logical than us, they had no difficulty understanding these stories as myth. They didn't need the facts to make sense because it wasn't a factual story. Now, we who pride ourselves on education and logic and science don't give ourselves permission to hear the stories of wonder, the stories of grace and of God. Maybe our questions about logic are a way for us to begin to capture our wonder once more. So dinosaurs or no dinosaurs, the story of Noah and the ark is gripping. And when we read it through the eyes of grace, it is inspiring. See you next time on Stump the Pastor. Thanks for your question, Gary. I hope you had a happy birthday as well. If you have a question you'd like for me to consider, send it to me. My email address is on your screen. See you next time on Stump the Pastor.